This is my brand new 2022 Polygon Siskiyou D7, and this could possibly be the best value downcountry bike on the market. But what even is a downcountry bike, and who is it for? But before we get to riding, we have to build this thing up, and I gotta show you this. This bike came shipped in the best packaging that I've ever seen. Quick disclaimer, Bikes Online, aka Polygon, did send me this bike to review it, but they did not tell me what to say, and this is not a paid sponsorship. And to put together a bike like this, it doesn't take much because it comes mostly assembled. And you don't even need a bike stand like this one. This Siskiyou D7 retails for $1,800 and it's sold by Bikes Online in either a 27.5 or a 29-inch version. The suspension is 120 millimeters front and back, which makes it fall into the downcountry category. And a downcountry bike is sort of like an XC bike with more upright geometry, and it eats up climbs, but it has longer travel, making it more capable on descents. So the good news is that Bikes Online sends this little care package, and it's really cool to see all these little attachments and a torque wrench that has all the tools you need to fully assemble this bike, except a shock pump. We'll get to that in a second. There's no particular order to install the parts, but when installing the bars, don't tighten them down all the way just yet. I'd say the most intimidating thing for a mail order bike is putting together the dropper post, but this one comes pre-routed and pretty easy to assemble, and you just hook the end of the cable with the yoke into the actuator, then you can slide the dropper into the seat tube while pulling down on the cable and housing at the bottom of the seat tube. Just make sure that the end of the housing is touching the seat post within the seat tube. And one great thing to see is that this dropper can be slammed all the way. After the bars, front wheel, and dropper are installed, you can set the bike down and install the provided pedals or your pedals of choice. Then center and fine-tune the bars and the handlebar levers to the angle that you want. Well, the bike is built up and I am impressed. For an $1,800 bike, this bike looks top of the line with its paint job. The tubing is hydroformed and it just looks very well thought out. But we aren't ready to ride just yet. We need to set up the suspension first, because if we don't, it'll feel like we're bottoming out all the time or like riding a rigid bike. To do that, we need to use this shock pump. And this costs like $26 on Amazon. And I'm just gonna stand on the bike with all my riding gear, just kind of leaned up against my car. And this O-ring tells us how much the shock compresses with our body weight. And it's usually recommended to start at about 30%. It looks like there's no sag indicator O-ring on the fork stanchion to let us see the sag. So I'll just use a friend to help out. Well, it turns out the fork is about 20% sag, which would make the ride feel too harsh. So I'm just gonna use my shock pump to remove some air. And it looks like that did the trick. Phew, what a ride. And a quick note, I'm gonna be referencing the Vitasmithy quite a bit because that's the only other modern full suspension that I've ridden. This bike is a 120 millimeter travel downcountry bike, and the Mythic is a 130 to 140 millimeter travel trail bike. So I think they exist in different categories, but they're also in the same price range. So I think it's worth talking about them both. The first thing I noticed when I started riding this bike is how playful and responsive it is right off the bat. I'm talking pedaling on flat, climbs, descents, everything. And maybe that's because of the 67-degree head tube angle, which is a degree steeper than the Vitas Mythic. So maybe a slacker head tube isn't always the way to go. And climbing was just so much easier, and I'm not exactly sure why. The C-tube angle is the same as the Mythic, but maybe it's the single pivot suspension linkage being more efficient, and that could be why I didn't notice much pedal bob like I noticed on the Mythic. I had a major dilemma on what size to get. The main numeric for sizing these days is called reach. My medium Mythic always felt too small for me, and it has a reach of 451 millimeters. I'm 5'9", and I feel like that height is right in between sizes, so I had no clue what to do. So I reached out to Bikes Online and they advised me to go with a large, and that has a 465 millimeter reach. Well, I can say that this large 29 fits me perfectly. I felt like I had way better bike handling and way more room to pedal, but then again, I've always preferred bigger bikes. I also really like the boost through axle on the rear, and that's the new standard these days. Plus, a through axle means that your wheel won't just fall out of the dropout mid-ride. Let's talk about the components, starting with the shocks. We'll talk about the fork in a minute because I have a small little gripe about this fork. So the rear shock is a RockShox Deluxe Select Plus, and it worked out really good. Sure, it'll take some time to find the right setting, But a brand name shock with debonair at this price range, that's impressive. And I really don't see a need to ever really upgrade this shock. For those wondering, there is an open setting and then there's a threshold setting, which makes the shock very stiff for climbing, but it's not a true lockout. But I don't really care for lockouts anyway. And with the rebound set to about 50%, I felt like I had great traction and the dampening was spot on for the chunky trails that I ride. The bars and stem are Entity branded, and that's Polygon's own component brand. But at 780 millimeters wide, this seems like a perfect width, and I really like the markings on the clamping surface to help with alignment. The dropper is a Trans X dropper with 170 millimeters travel. And boy was I glad to see that this seat post could be slammed. But even with this dropper post slammed, I wasn't able to firmly plant my feet on the ground while seated. But also, I haven't been able to do that with any mountain bike just yet. And it's not the worst thing in the world. The 170 millimeter travel was too long for me, and fully extended, I couldn't comfortably pedal, so I just made sure I didn't extend it all the way. Pretty easy solution. Plus, if I went to resell this longer travel dropper, I'm sure it'll have a much higher resale value than say a 125 millimeter. The brakes are a definite weak point. This bike comes with Shimano MT201 hydraulic brakes with a 180 millimeter rotor in the front and 160 in the rear. I was able to stop quickly with these MT201s, but I did have to pull the lever pretty hard with 2 fingers. And the feel of the lever is very generic. With that said, these brakes are very standard on almost all budget and entry-level bikes. Compared to the Mythic's MT401s, they're about the same, and both of these brake sets would be one of the first things that I replace. The drivetrain really stood out to me, and it might seem like it's just another Dior drivetrain, but this is an 11-speed cassette that goes from 11 to 51 teeth. To have that much range right out of the box on this cheap a bike is just awesome, and a 51-tooth cassette is a major luxury. This Dior model is the M5100, which is pretty beefed up compared to the Dior 5120 10-speed that comes on the Mythic. This one can handle a 51-tooth, and you can tell it is much beefier. This bike comes pre-tuned, so the shifting was perfect right out of the box, which is probably the biggest concern for people ordering a bike through the mail. It has a clutch that stiffens up the derailleur when hitting bumps, and it helps prevent against chain slap and chain drops, but you do have to remember to turn it on. And I learned that the hard way. The wheels have Entity branded rims and have 30 millimeters internal width that are tubeless ready rims. And that's really important to me because I have to run tubeless or slime in my tubes due to all the cactus spikes on the trails, and I wasn't able to get slime in the Presta valve tubes. So I had to figure something out. I removed the tire and was a little bummed to see that the rims weren't pre-taped for tubeless. But a little Gorilla Tape and a tubeless valve plus sealant and boom, it's already converted to tubeless. And this was my first time using Schwalbe knobby Nick tires, and I have no complaints. They are 2.25 inches wide and had great traction on loose over hard, plus they're decently lightweight. I thought I'd miss having the bigger 2.6 inch tires, but I didn't at all. And yes, these are tubeless ready tires. But let's talk about the biggest issue with this bike, and that's the fork. The fork is a RockShox Recon RL that is a 120 millimeter travel air fork, and it felt pretty good on the trail, but I think I rode with the rebound too fast. The rebound adjuster is just this plastic tab thing that's pretty cheap feeling, but it is functional. I also noticed some discoloration on the stanchions, but not really sure why. But the elephant in the room is that they are non-boost forks, meaning that they don't have the new standard of 110 millimeter hub spacing. And the reason why that's a big deal is because most top-end forks these days aren't sold in 100 millimeter wide non-boost spacing. So if you want to splurge a little bit and upgrade to say like a Fox fork, well, you either need to replace the hub or the whole front wheel. And this could be a non-issue for the entry-level mountain biker, but it'll definitely be an issue for me because I'll probably upgrade this fork in the future. Another thing that I don't like is internal cable routing, which is just in the front triangle. I prefer external cable routing because that can easily change parts around. Now, changing the brakes will become a major job, where I have to potentially get hydraulic fluid everywhere and then fish the tubing through the frame and then bleed the brakes. But I will say that the cable management is done really well on this bike with rubber grommets, and I didn't hear any cables clinking around at all. It's worth noting that the shipping can sometimes take a little while for this bike. To buy this bike, or pretty much any bike these days, you have to check the website frequently, as this bike goes in and out of stock pretty much all the time. But with the climate that we live in and dealing with overseas shipping and supply chain issues, shipping delays can happen. So to answer the very first question of this video, is this the best value downcountry bike on the market? I'd say absolutely yes. If you were to buy all the parts individually, I loosely estimate that it'd cost $1,650. Plus, there are some seriously nice components on this bike. So who is this bike for? I'd say that this bike is perfect for a new person getting into mountain biking because it's such a playful bike in all areas. Riding as of late has become kind of a chore for me, but now, with how fun this bike is, I didn't want to stop riding today. The 120 millimeters of travel is perfect for someone who rides XC trails or maybe a step up. And that's all that I ride, and that's what a beginner would ride too. We don't all live in Whistler, and I've never even been to a bike park. Mountain biking doesn't always have to be about riding double black diamonds and risking your life every ride. And a long travel bike really takes the fun out of XC trails, which I've grown to love. So if this review helped you and you want to buy a Polygon, it'd mean the world to me if you'd click my link in the description, which is an affiliate link. And what that means is if you click the link and buy the bike, I get a commission from the sale, but it doesn't cost you anything extra. And you'd also be majorly supporting the channel. I'll see you on the next one.